This is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Otelli Edwards. Tonight's top stories from East Asia. China convenes its third plenum with a focus on reform and modernization. Our correspondent and expert guest explore what's emerging as a blueprint for recovery in a struggling economy. And the latest figures substantiating China's economic concerns as GDP growth slows sharply, piling pressure on policymakers to boost domestic demand and to find answers to a prolonged property downturn. Also, China issues a navigational warning barring entry to parts of the South China Sea for military drills. This just a day after joint exercises with Russia in the Pacific. And the burgeoning business of South Korean culture, amplified by social media. A report forecasts spending to double to more than $140 billion in the next few years. And ahead on East Asia Tonight, a contaminated cooking oil scandal in China, renewing fears over food safety in the country. Why is this happening, and what more can be done for the industry as a whole? We'll delve into this topic with an expert. The 20th Central Committee of the Communist Party of China, or CPC, has started its third plenary session in Beijing, and it involves several closed-door meetings, which will include Chinese President Xi Jinping and other top leaders. Well, traditionally, the gathering sets out major economic and social development goals for the country. But as the CNA's Tan Zihui finds out, it may not be the case this time around.
Deepening reform and advancing Chinese modernization will be the key focus of the highly anticipated third plenum. That's according to state media. It indicates that the outcomes of the once-every-5-year meeting will likely focus on further cementing CCP leadership and socialist values and guiding the country to harness so-called new quality productive forces, such as AI and other stranglehold technologies that are at the mercy of its Western rivals.
Now the government want to stress their intention to put and their willingness to put more resources in developing the high-tech sector. And they say that the high-quality productive forces will be the driver for China's growth in the next several decades to come.
President Xi Jinping first introduced the concept of Chinese modernization in a speech in 2021 to mark the party's centennial, calling it a new model for human civilization.
Why we try to do it Chinese style instead of like the world style? Because we are tired of America, like the United States, being the leader of the whole world. And I think they are not doing a great job.
在中国国情的基础下，然后进行的现代化发展。
我感觉现在国家肯定都重视到这方面了，也关注到这方面了。
The third plenum is the third full meeting of the CCP Central Committee and one of 7 such sessions to be held during the 5-year term of the elite body. It typically takes place during the months of September to November, the year after the National Congress of the CCP. It is also widely considered as the most consequential one. So when it did not happen last year, eyebrows were raised.
But as China battles economic headwinds on many fronts, including the ongoing property crisis, analysts say the leadership may not want to rock the boat too much with any drastic reform measures.
I see the key word would be consistency and stability for this session, because China is now in an uphill battle dealing with economic development and also global pressure. And so right now, to keep the central leadership of Xi Jinping, and on top of that, to push more of the leadership of the Communist Party at different institutions would be the desired outcome out of this meeting.
The world's second biggest economy is expected to hit its growth target of around 5% this year. Even so, economists say Chinese policymakers need to ramp up structural changes to focus on long-term economic policy. That's as the country grapples with the declining population, shrinking labor force, and weakened business confidence.
China needs to broaden its tax base by, in a way, increasing, say, individual income tax, corporate tax, or to avoid more tax evasion in the future. And along the way, it has to maintain the financial stability because most of the commercial banks in China are highly exposed to the housing market. The non-performing loan issue has crippled basically the banks and local government to do the productive projects they wish to start. And as a result, I think people are quite looking forward to those major changes in the third plenum.
Also to look out for are potential personnel changes on the back of 2 former defense ministers' expulsion. Tan Sihui, CNA, Beijing.
Well, China's economy slowed sharply in the second quarter, a protracted property downturn and lackluster consumer spending knocking the wind out of a fragile economy. That, experts say, would pile pressure on the country's leaders to act more aggressively to rev up growth as they gather in Beijing to chart the course of the economy over the next half-decade. GDP expanded 4.7% on year, below expectations and slower than the previous quarter. Beijing has targeted growth of around 5% for the year, a number that analysts described as ambitious. Data for June also told a similar story. Industrial production beat expectations, but retail sales came in worse than forecast, showing sluggish domestic demand. And fixed asset investment matched expectations, while property investment was down double digits. Now, China's new home prices in June fell at the fastest clip in 9 years, while property sales and investment slumped. And they slid 4.5% from a year earlier, deeper than a 4% slide in May, while used home values tumbled nearly 8%. New home prices in 70 cities dropped 0.7% month-on-month in June after a 0.67% dip in May. Authorities have taken a series of small steps to juice growth, including cutting interest rates and doling out cheap loans to banks to spur lending to households and businesses. But the figures add to evidence that those moves did little to boost sentiment in the real estate market. Well, the faltering GDP data keeping alive expectations that Beijing will need to unleash even more stimulus. Analysts expect cutting debt and boosting confidence to be a priority at this week's third plenum in Beijing. The Shanghai Composite managing to end the trading day in the green zone with minor gains, while the Shenzhen component languishing. In Hong Kong, the benchmark Hang Seng Index closed down 1.5%. The Hang Seng Properties Index and the Tech Index both calling it a day down more than 2.5%. And for more, we are joined now by CNA's Olivia Seong. She's reporting live to us from Beijing, as well as Haron Lim, an economist from Moody's Analytics. Well, thanks so very much for joining us this evening. First question to you, Olivia. It appears there are no big shakes that's going to be expected, but sort of more on building on these existing policies. But with the Q2 data, GDP data showing that China's growth is slowing, particularly with regards to domestic consumption. Do you think, Olivia, this adds more pressure on this third plenum to introduce measures to perhaps give the economy a boost?
I'll tell you, well, we first have to note when it comes to these big set-piece meetings for the Communist Party, the agenda would have been set some time back. And we do know that the announcement of the dates of this third plenum had been announced last month after the Politburo had met. Also, we have to note that these are long-standing challenges facing the economy. China's leadership has also acknowledged this. And the data that we have seen being released today just reflecting the extent of the headwinds that are facing China's economy, and that's despite the government putting in measures to try and mitigate the biggest drags on the economy when it comes to domestic consumption and the property sector. We are seeing prices of homes in certain cities in more cities increasing, perhaps indicating some stability in the sector. But analysts are saying that there is still a long way to go, even though it seems that indications are that authorities aren't looking at particularly strong measures. And Haron, this is where I'd be keen to get your take. We know that the stakes are high, both domestically and internationally. Why do you think the leadership is not keen to put a strong shot in the arm for the Chinese economy that some quarters have called for?
So thanks for having me. I think the key question here has been about manufacturing and how it has been front and center of the Chinese growth strategy in 2024. And this has allowed them to really overshoot a lot of the woes that have been seen in consumption and also in private investment, particularly in the property segment. And fiscal stability and the sustainability of stimulus are dual priorities for the Chinese government. The accumulation of debt among local governments mean that the Chinese central government has to pick up the spending tab if there is a stimulus to be spent. So it seems to be choosing to be a spender of last resort to keep its financial powers aimed at spending where it matters most. So ultimately, if we do see numbers continue to slow in July and August, we are expecting intervention coming from this the central government with regards to a mid-year budget adjustment, like the way that we have seen last year.
All right, and Haran, you've mentioned China's a spender of last resort, and typically, such plenums like that, it typically focuses on the long-term issues. But I'm wondering, in terms of the immediate issues, the day-to-day concerns for the citizens, especially, right? How do you think those sort of issues, whether it's housing, it's weak consumption sentiment, how do you think those issues are going to be tackled?
Yes, so a lot of these issues, in terms of immediate issues, have to be tackled head-on before they can really look at the longer-term issues. So what we are expecting there to be from the third plenum is a mixture of both addressing near-term concerns and also on the longer-term issues. And for near-term concerns, particularly on the consumption sentiment, we are expecting things to be addressed from both the labor market as well as reforms on the value-add tax. With regards to the labor market, we are definitely expecting more skills matching and skills training that should help unemployed workers, particularly those youth unemployed workers, to get to new jobs quicker and hence potentially boost incomes for there to be more spending. And we are also expecting some reforms on value-add tax. The current standard tax is at about 13%, but there are some parts of which are reduced for certain key goods. And we do see that Chinese tourism has actually been attracted by duty-free spending elsewhere in the region. So such reforms to potentially moderate the consumption tax or the value-add tax could actually help consumption spending domestically. We are also hopeful, although less likely, to see that there would be direct support to the Chinese household in form of things such as more consumption vouchers. But this may be a bridge too far for Chinese policymakers that places the emphasis on self-reliance. In terms of housing, we definitely see the case for more support for the property market, but it is a balancing act. I think previous ways of trying to build their way out of trouble has run its course, and hence we are expecting more work to be done on perhaps expanding the buyback scheme that officials have announced back in May. But more importantly is about the implementation and access, which is how quick the implementation would be and how well the access would be. Will it be just catering to local residents or even to those migrant workers that may not have their domestic hukou within the place that they work? I think that those areas will definitely be key to see if there would be policies to address.
Very interesting there. And Ollie, we know that this third plenum has just kicked off. Perhaps you could just give us, walk us through a timeline of what we can expect in the next few days in Beijing.
Well, I'll tell you what we do know is that right now, as the plenum is ongoing, over 370 permanent and alternate members of the party's central committee are meeting behind closed doors. As Haran has mentioned, there's a lot to be discussed, and this meeting will take place over 4 days amid heightened security here in Beijing, including a drone ban in the city as well. We know that state media today reporting that President Xi has delivered a work report out on behalf of the party's Politburo and elaborated on a draft decision on further comprehensively deepening reform and advancing Chinese modernization. Now, that sounds like a lot of jargon, but what it essentially means and observers are expecting out of this is a further extension of President Xi's signature policies when we are talking about high quality development, that transition and transformation of the economy that has seen previously rapid economic growth to more slower but high quality growth. That is to be deliberated over the next few days. Now, us as journalists, we do not have access to these meetings, and what we will be looking out for are reports from state media, particularly at the end of the 4 days where we will expect a brief communique on the outcome of the meetings to be published, but that may not be the be-all and all. The full extent of the outcomes of this meeting will be published a few days later when a decision, a lengthy document alongside another document articulating President Xi's thinking and explanation behind some of the decisions that have been made during that meeting, that will be announced, released a few days after the close of this plenum. In the meantime, though, we are left to read the tea leaves. And here I want to ask Karen again, we have seen in state media a comparison between the 1978, that iconic third plenum, which was seen as launching China's reform and opening up under then paramount leader Deng Xiaoping, and that has been compared to 2013, that third plenum that was held for the first time by President Xi when he first took office. The language that has been used by President Xi and state media has been that these were epoch-making plenums. And now, this time round, state media is saying that this third plenum is set to be a new starting point and another milestone in deepening China's reform. How much progress would you say has been made since 2013 and the pledges that had been laid out in that third plenum? And what does the language signal about what's to come this time round?
Yeah, so I think in 2013, what we have observed is definitely a pledge that markets will play a decisive rather than just a fundamental role in resource allocation. We have seen from the document in 2013 that has promised much liberalization in areas like interest rates, property rights, financial markets, as well as foreign investments. But we do see that the record is a little bit mixed. Now, we do have seen liberalization in areas for the interest rates in particular, and in more recent months under current governor Pan Gongsheng, he has actually enacted a lot of work towards a market-based interest rate reform. But we also have seen a bit more of a stronger hand by state-owned enterprises in the Chinese economy, and therefore that pledge on a fundamental level seems to be a bit mixed. And I think in terms of that kind of progress, then we could potentially see some of those policies that have been vowed to have changed since 2013 to be changed again, to be implemented again. Things that have not been implemented in 2013 thus far is the introduction of the property tax, the raising of the retirement age, and also potentially allowing a larger role for, again, the private sector to come in to invest in state-owned enterprises. So I think that remains to be seen whether these proposals that hasn't been taken up in 2013 will be taken up this year, but we are definitely looking forward to those policies.
So, Harriet, just before we go, very quickly, I want to get your perspective from a global point of view, because this plenum clearly being watched around the world. So what do you think foreign businesses will be looking out for? What kind of, assurances, for instance?
I think the reassurance that the Chinese government could potentially give now is definitely on a stable regulatory environment. I think there has been certain concerns that the regulatory environment has been uncertain with various issues surrounding, for instance, the private tuition broadband, as well as also video gaming, for instance. Those industries have seen certain regulations pushed through very quickly that has upended their industries domestically. So, and therefore, what I think the foreign businesses will definitely be looking out for is about those assurances of a stable regulatory environment, that they can expect stable returns to come through to their companies, and also be able to compete with the state-owned enterprises and with domestic private companies. And hopefully there's actually even more of an opening up of the Chinese economy, as there seems to be a concern, at least from the West, from the US and the EU, that the Chinese economy is actually not sufficiently opened up to their Western companies as compared to how Western economies are opened to Chinese enterprises for both trade as well as investments. So I think that's where if there is actually more equal regulations there, potentially that can be foreign businesses can be really reassured in that regard.
Hey, thanks so very much for that chat. Haron Lim, economist from Moody's Analytics, and as always, CNA's Olivia Song, thanks so very much speaking to us live from Beijing. Well, it's time now for us to go for a short break, but coming up in East Asia tonight, a look at how social media frenzy around KA content is giving a push to the country's cultural exports. Plus, Apple and Samsung see global smartphone shipments rise in the second quarter, with the tech giants losing their market share to Chinese rivals. From music to film, technology to food, the world has fallen in love with everything South Korean, and that's translating into big bucks. Global spending in Korean cultural products is estimated to nearly double to $143 billion by 2030, driven by viral content on social media. Well, that's according to a new study by TikTok and analytics firm Kanta. Well, the Korean wave, referred to as Hallyu for the country's cultural exports, is currently estimated at $76 billion. Well, TikTok and Kanta forecast that the numbers will only grow further in the next 6 years as Korean culture expands beyond the US, East Asia, and Southeast Asia. The key factor for that? Social media. Well, TikTok has been at the epicenter of K-pop fandom online, and it has consistently driven engagement by attracting users to various Korean-related topics. Well, just a few months ago, a rapper Cardi B posted a video on TikTok reviewing buldak noodles. It garnered nearly 40 million views. Subsequently, shares of Samyang Foods soared by 30% to a record high. The company's stock also more than doubled this year. Well, TikTok's influence in South Korea is rather overshadowed by the likes of YouTube and Instagram. However, that's not the case in the US and Southeast Asia. Research says that over 80% of users discovered Korean culture through TikTok. And current global spending in Korean music is set to grow about $11.6 billion this year, while spending on Korean beauty products and food projected to rise more than $20 billion each. Reports indicate that this boost is likely to continue next year as well. Apple and Samsung saw an increase in smartphone shipments in the second quarter, but Chinese rivals ate into their market share. According to preliminary data from market intelligence firm IDC, global smartphone shipments rose 6.5% to over 285 million units, while Apple's quarterly shipments climbed 1.5% on year to over 45 million units. Stronger performance in countries including China is said to have boosted Apple's performance. And on the other hand, world's largest smartphone sellers, Samsung, sold more than 53 million units. That is up 0.7% on year. More focus on flagship models and the use of AI in its products helping Samsung's sales. But at the same time, both Samsung and Apple are losing their market share to Chinese companies. IDC says Xiaomi, which is the third largest smartphone shipper in the quarter, saw sales rise almost 27% on year to more than 42 million units. Vivo came in fourth at 22%, shipping more than 25 million units. Coming up on East Asia tonight, a temporary halt in fighting on the horizon for a conflict-torn state in Myanmar. Plus, China and Russia begin joint drills in the South China Sea amid tensions with NATO over Beijing's relationship with Moscow. China convenes a key political meeting, the third plenum, with a focus on reform and modernization. China's GDP growth slows to 4.7% in the second quarter, falling far short of forecasts, piling pressure on policymakers to boost domestic demand and to find answers to a prolonged property downturn. And the burgeoning business of South Korea's popular culture. A report forecasts spending to double to more than $140 billion in the next few years. China is barring entry into parts of the South China Sea ahead of military drills in the area tomorrow. It has issued a navigational warning. Now, a ceremony was held on Sunday to mark the start of the joint exercise that Beijing says it's conducting with Russia. The drills are taking place in the waters off near Zhanjiang City in southern Guangdong, which faces the South China Sea. The PLA Southern Theater Command Navy's headquarters is also there. Chinese officials say the exercises will demonstrate the resolve and capabilities of both sides to address maritime security threats, as well as preserve regional peace and stability. The Russian Defense Ministry says 2 of its warships are taking part in the joint naval drills. The 2 also held a joint maritime patrol in the northern and western Pacific. China has stressed that it is not targeted at any other nation in particular or related to current regional tensions. No details were provided on the Pacific maneuvers, including the ship's routes, their exact locations, or the nature of the forces involved. Now, the drills come on the heels of China's latest tensions with NATO last week. The military alliance had accused Beijing of being a decisive enabler in Russia's war against Ukraine. China has called the accusations groundless. Its foreign minister warning the West against stirring up confrontation. An alliance of ethnic minority groups in Myanmar has announced a 4-day ceasefire with the military government. The groups have been engaged in combat in the northern Shan state after fighters seized territory along a strategic highway to Yunnan, China. Now, the area has been rocked by fighting since late last month, when the so-called Three Brotherhood Alliance renewed an offensive against military troops. The clashes ended a previous China-brokered truce. Now, the new agreement, though, does not cover the Mandalay region, and that's where members of the alliance and other opponents of the military have been battling the government in recent weeks. Amid the renewed fighting earlier this month, one of Myanmar's top generals has traveled to China to discuss security cooperation along the border. Public fury continues to simmer in China as authorities investigate the latest food safety scandal rocking the country. Local media have accused a number of transportation firms of using the same tanker trucks to deliver fuel and cooking oil without any cleaning in between the different cargo loads. Experts say that the illegal practice could cause a series of health problems, including nausea, vomiting, and even irreversible organ damage. Food safety has been a long-running issue in China, with local media uncovering dozens of high-profile cases since the early 2000s. In 2008, 6 children died and some 300,000 others fell ill after consuming a milk powder formula supplied by then major player Sanlu Group. The product was tainted by the toxic industrial chemical melamine. While several executives found responsible or handed death sentences, the tragedy drove mistrust towards China's domestic products. Now, the widespread sale of gutter oil also emerged as a major problem in the early 2010s. And that's when some restaurants and vendors were found to have used waste cooking oil from the gutter, household drains, and even grease traps. And this led to a crackdown by Chinese authorities on the black market, with goods seized and people detained. In 2014, a Chinese man, Chu Chuanfeng, was sentenced to death for producing tainted oil and selling it to dealers for some $7 billion. Well, the latest cooking oil scandal has fueled food safety concerns once again, with some members of the public looking for alternative options. And for more analysis, let's bring in John Yasuda, Associate Professor of Political Science at Johns Hopkins University. Well, thanks so much for joining us this evening, Professor. Now, you've written this book on feeding the masses back in 2017, which identifies the root causes of China's regulatory failures in food safety. So, Professor, I'm wondering, how does this latest contaminated cooking oil scandal highlight some bits of this issue which China has?
Well, thanks for having me. Yes, we're dealing with a persistent, extraordinarily complex policy issue that regulators and, state policymakers have been trying to address for the last 2 decades. And we have seen some improvement. We've seen, better books, better laws on the books. We've seen better rules and regulations, improved corporate responsibility and logistics management. But at the end of the day, this is a system that is very much a work in progress, right? We've seen a new law that first came out in 2009 be amended about 3 to 4 times. Since then, we've seen several major restructurings of the regulatory agency in charge of food safety. So it's very much a system in flux, trying to catch up with the demands of an extraordinarily complex, difficult food production and supply chain to deal with.
So here we're saying, Professor, that in terms of China's regulatory process, it has improved somewhat for a number of years now, but it is complex. So it was reported, however, that there are some of these state-run companies, including, I believe, Sino-Grain and the Hopeful Grain and Oil Group, who are also involved in this latest scandal. So what extent do you think, Professor, that this is going to snowball into yet another major food scandal, or perhaps it's already considered a major one?
It's already a major food scandal, that's for sure. What we should expect to see is some sort of announcement during the 3rd plenum. There should be some major campaigns, which will mean that a number of officials that are working on the food safety issue will be sending out teams, and they're probably already preparing to send out teams to investigate transport companies, oil production companies, and processors throughout the country, which means that their day-to-day inspections and monitoring for other items will have to cease. It's important to realize that regulation is not just driven by crisis. Regulation is, your day-to-day routine monitoring and surveillance that you're conducting. And, this crisis sort of mentality, which is really the MO of the food safety system at the current juncture, does sort of get in the way of institution building and strengthening food safety on a day-to-day basis. I'm concerned that, that what we will see is that there's going to be a burst of regulatory activity, and then it will sort of quiet down, and then, we'll wait until the next major food safety scandal for regulators to hit the pavement again to deal with whatever issue that emerges. The main concern with all of this is that you already have a very anxious food consumer base in China, and I don't think that this sort of this frequent occurrence of these problems will instill much confidence, even if food safety has improved dramatically over the last, decade since the melamine crisis that you had mentioned previously.
Right. And Professor, as you mentioned, there's probably this whole burst of regulatory checks right now because of this scandal. But at the same time, there are also reports saying that this practice is prevalent. It's open, and it's kind of an open secret in the industry. I mean, based on all the interviews that, you have done, is that the sense that you get as well?
Yes. I mean, the main issue here is that you have an extraordinarily complex supply chain, right? So this is one of many open secrets in the food production and supply chain system. And the issue here is you don't have enough personnel on the ground who are actively, monitoring these things. The fact of the matter is that regulators across the world are generally understaffed to deal with this issue, which means that you have to have some degree of corporate responsibility. And so we really do need some improvements, on sort of addressing these logistics and production chain problems. If it's not going to be in oil, it will be in some sort of issue with microbial contamination, with pesticide residue, maximum residue limits reached, or food additive problems. And this is a function that of China's complex food production chain, right? We have over 100 million farms that are supplying into hundreds of thousands of processors that change hands with tens of thousands of traders and various logistics chains, and which makes for a very, very challenging traceability system. And so these sorts of problems are bound to happen, unfortunately. What is heartening about this episode, of course, is that we have state media that has actively reported on this issue as it's emerged. We have a very alert, a more alert consumer base to these sorts of problems. And the regulators have been very forthcoming with the problem in terms of trying to deal with the problem and launch investigations. So we see a significant movement in terms of addressing an issue relatively quickly than in the past. But unfortunately, right, especially given that these are sort of the major, state producers and suppliers of cooking oil, this is definitely an embarrassment for the regulatory system. But I think we should hope at least that things are at least going in in the right direction, generally speaking.
And Professor, what are the implications for global food trade then? Because, there is that reputational hit, right, that China has to take, especially when it comes to food products.
You're right. I think there will be a number of people that will be concerned by any food product that is made in China. But it's important to realize that the export food safety regime in China is distinct from the domestic food safety regulatory system. So food that is slated for export in China is generally produced on specially licensed farms. It's handled by a different group of quality assurance personnel and is subject to different supply chain management protocols. And so I wouldn't be too worried that we should see this bleed over from what's going on in the domestic supply chain for those products slated for export. But undoubtedly, people will be a bit more concerned. The incidences of tainted food coming from China are not, unfortunately, rare. There have been instances of various sort of types of microbial contamination and rot and food additives that have moved out of the country. But in general, the export controls that are placed on food products is high, and it is functioning with a high level of cooperation with importers and exports to ensure safe food.
Right. Professor, it's interesting you mentioned that the export food safety quality is actually quite different from what's being consumed domestically. So as this plenum, is moving along and has kickstarted, what do you think, what sort of announcement or sort of reforms do you think will be announced or related to food safety within China?
Again, I think there will be a focus on sort of stringency, increased inspections and investigations, perhaps discussions about new licensing rules for food processors dealing with cooking oil products. But we have to understand that there has been a great deal done as a matter of legislation with regards to food safety, with amendments coming in every 3 to 4 years following the 2009 promulgation of the food safety law. And so we've seen already massive improvements in terms of corporate supplier responsibility, with new whistleblower laws, with food penalties being updated, and a general sort of improvement across the board of rules and regs. So what we will see, following the third plenum is really going to be the emphasis on this particular scandal, right? There is a logic behind a regulatory campaign because you want to restore confidence as soon as possible. You want to show that the state is actively trying to address an issue of popular concern. And that's what will be the focus. As a matter of legislation and rules and regs, China already has good stuff on the books. So it's always, and this is going to be quite boring to hear for most China watchers, but it's always a question of implementation. How do you actually realize those goals on the ground? And it becomes particularly challenging when you just have a food production base that is as complicated and difficult as China's. I mean, I recall talking to a senior food safety official when we were comparing food safety systems between the United States, Europe, and that of China. And he basically laughed at me saying that I couldn't even, as an American, I couldn't even begin to imagine the level of complexity of the supply chain. And I was berated by him for close to half an hour because, I was putting forward these sort of best practices that are established outside in developing economies, whereas, China's context is extraordinarily more challenging.
Well, thanks so very much for sharing with us, including that personal anecdote. Associate Professor John Yasuda from Johns Hopkins University. Right, time now for another short break. But coming up on East Asia tonight, Japan set to host leaders of Pacific Islands tomorrow as the battle for influence in the region heats up. Plus, with just over a week to go before the 2024 Paris Olympics, the Olympic torch arrives in the French capital. Japan is hosting more than a dozen Pacific Island leaders tomorrow in a summit that Japanese media say is set to express, quote, strong opposition to any unilateral attempt to change the status quo in the region. The Pacific Islands Leaders Meeting is a forum between Japan and 18 island nations, including Australia and New Zealand. In a letter to the Japan Times today, Prime Minister Fumio Kishida says his country and the island nations are indispensable partners. According to Kyodo News, Mr. Kishida is expected to announce a significant aid package at the meeting to counter China's influence and bring the islands closer to Japan. Also on the agenda are Japan's release of treated wastewater from the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant into the Pacific, North Korea's weapons programs, and measures to counter disinformation and to strengthen cybersecurity. The Olympic torch relay has arrived in Summer Games host city, Paris, with competition starting in about 10 days' time. Now, the torch has spent almost 2 months zigzagging through France and French overseas territories. And large crowds flocked to the city's iconic landmarks to witness former French football player Thierry Henry kick off the relay as the first torchbearer. Making its mark in Paris, the torch's arrival coincides with Bastille Day, national holiday in France. And over at the Louvre Museum, fans gathered to catch a glimpse of South Korean K-pop group BTS member Jin. Jin ran about 200 meters before returning the torch to the relay center at the museum. A 31-year-old is the first BTS member to complete his mandatory military service. The relay will culminate with the lighting of the cauldron during the game's opening ceremony. And here on CNA, we will be bringing you coverage of the Paris Summer Olympic Games. MediaCorp and its platforms will air nearly 4,000 hours of sporting action from the 27th of July to the 12th of August. So make sure you tune in for those updates. A French sports minister, meantime, took the plunge and swam in the River Seine on Saturday. And the mayor of Paris is set to do the same this week. Why? Well, to prove that the river is safe for competitors at the Olympics to swim in. Well, the French capital's iconic waterway is meant to host multiple events, including the triathlon, when the Games begin later this month. Clara Lee with a story.
The Seine that flows through the heart of Paris is a river overflowing with history, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, said to be the home of Joan of Arc's ashes and often called one of the world's most romantic rivers. But it's also one that has been plagued by pollution for years. Paris uses a 19th century sanitation system, which collects both sewage and rainwater. Now, usually, the wastewater flows through a network of underground tunnels to treatment plants on the city's outskirts. But when there is heavy rain, the system can be overwhelmed. The excess wastewater then gushes from the potholes along the river banks and floods the Seine. So when Paris was awarded the bid to host the 2024 Olympics and the outdoor swim races were planned to be held in this river, the so-called swimming plan was officially set into motion. A $1.5 billion project to make the river clean enough for Olympians in 2024 and open it up for the public next year, overturning a century-old ban. Now, the process involved thousands of new underground pipes and tanks, chief among them a gigantic underground reservoir. It's fed by a 700-meter-long tunnel to collect excess water during storms. The mega basin can hold the equivalent of 20 Olympic swimming pools of dirty water. But that itself wasn't enough. Last August, the swimming marathon test events had to be cancelled because the water quality wasn't up to safety standards. Officials, however, have remained optimistic. In fact, French President Emmanuel Macron and Paris Mayor Anne Hidalgo went as far as to promise to take a dip in the Seine. Hidalgo initially scheduled her swim on the 23rd of June. That sparked an online campaign by angry Parisians who were protesting the Games and its huge cost. They planned to defecate en masse to fill the river with human feces on the very same day. The mayor postponed her planned dip, citing parliamentary elections. But as late as last month, the river water has remained unfit for swimming, with data showing levels of E. coli, an indicator of fecal matter, to be 10 times above the acceptable limit. Now, despite rising concerns, authorities insist the water quality will become satisfactory just in time for the Games. For now, athletes are keeping their fingers crossed, as organizers have made it clear that there is no plan B.
I hope you've enjoyed this Monday's edition of East Asia Tonight. Don't forget, you can get your headlines anytime at cna.asia and CNA 938 Radio. Thanks for watching.